All right, so I just saw God's Not Dead, In God We Trust. Let's talk about it. Directed by Vance Knoll, stars David A.R. White, Ray Wise, Isaiah Washington, Scott Baio, and a whole bunch of other people. This is the fifth film in the God's Not Dead franchise. You had God's Not Dead, God's Not Dead 2, God's Not Dead, A Light in the Darkness, God's Not Dead, We the People, and now God's Not Dead, In God We Trust. The first film came out in 2014, so yeah, 10 years. If I had to sum up what these movies are about, I would say this is about, Christians standing up for their faith in public places. So the first one was all about him standing up for his faith in his college classroom in front of a professor who wanted them to write it on paper, God's Not Dead. God's Not 2 was about a teacher who, answered a student's question in the classroom and was taken to task over it, taken to court over it, was sued over it. God's Not Dead 3, I really don't remember. Honestly, that one is the most forgettable of the five, for me anyway. God's Not Dead 4 was all about homeschooling and, fighting for the right to educate our children however we see fit. And now this one is all about politics and the role that Christians play in elections. Now, I've said this many times before, that Christian films, for me anyway, are the hardest to review because the standard is so low. Now, I think God's Not Dead, that franchise, has set its own standard because these films move and operate a certain way, and they also have a very clear purpose. I've always said this as well, that with Christian films, you can preach the gospel without giving a sermon. God's Not Dead, to me, is the exception to that rule because this is a sermon. These movies are a sermon of sorts. Hell, it's a whole worship experience. I mean, you have your preacher or whoever is leading in that film. There is a designated preacher that these stories kind of revolve around, and we'll talk about him in a minute. But you have whoever's leading, you had the student in the first film, you had the teacher in the second, and then you had parents in the fourth film. Again, I don't remember much about the third one. And now you have the preacher who's kind of leading the charge, going to Washington saying, I'm running for Congress. So you have your preacher of sorts. You have the message that's being presented to the congregation, which are Christians. These movies are made for Christians, minus the first one, which I feel like is the gospel presentation of the franchise. And then you have worship music, because Newsboys is in every single movie. These films are a little bit different than I think your typical Christianese films, in that most of your Christianese films, everyone's so happy and sweet and everything works out. Christians presenting themselves the way they want to be seen instead of the way they actually are. Whereas I think these movies are all about presenting the hardships of Christianity, some of the harder things we face, such as doubt, walking in our faith, standing up for our faith, how do we talk about our faith. So a lot of the things that we tend to not talk about so much, or will gloss over in sermons, or preachers will present in a very, simple little light, but don't give us anything practical. That's what these films do. It's all about, standing up for your faith, declaring that God is Lord, that God is not dead. But that title in and of itself is not just a declaration, God is not dead, but it's a reminder to Christians in general, God's not dead, so why are you walking around like a zombie? This film is no different, I feel like, in terms of quality than the last few films. Honestly, it's definitely a whole lot better than the last one. I thought the last one was just not good at all. Good message, nice little rallying cry, but overall just not good. This, I think, was so much better. Now, with this movie, the way it kind of just takes off running, if you're not familiar with this pastor in the movie, Pastor Dave, I don't know if you will I don't know how you're going to operate in this. I feel like in order for you to understand who this pastor is and why this is such a challenge for him, you're going to need to at least watch that very first movie, because this pastor is the most consistent character in all the movies, minus Martin, the Chinese American student, well, not Chinese American, the Chinese student who came to Christ in the first film, who's become like almost his apprentice, his prodigy, so to speak. Someone that is growing in his faith and has aspirations for wanting to be a preacher. But this preacher is the thread that connects all of these films. And we really have seen this pastor kind of grow and develop in his own faith, struggle with his faith, and also struggle with how to operate in his faith outside of the church. But the whole point of this movie is it's all about putting God first, and what that looks like when you put God first in every aspect of your life, including voting. That phrase, Christian nationalism, gets thrown around all the time, right? Anytime a Christian speaks up and says anything holy that looks political, it's Christian nationalism. Now, what Christian nationalism actually is, and the way people are using it, it's basically an accusation that Christians dare to put God first. And I don't see what's so wrong with that. Being a Christian myself, when I go to the ballot to vote, I want to make sure that I'm putting God first, that I am following Jesus to the best of my ability in everything that I do, and that includes voting. And I think this movie is a nice little reminder that we can't just leave God out of our decisions. The audacity to allow people who don't even believe in God to tell us how to walk with the Lord. It's getting dark. That's kind of the point, because I am not going home until it's dark out, because we still don't have power. And my room don't cool down for nothing. If you're just coming across this, I live in the city of New Orleans. We just had a hurricane, and our power got knocked out after the storm left. Don't get me started. I mean, on the spectrum of Hollywood quality, this isn't high up there. This is really just in the realm of Christian cinema, and I think these movies are, minus that fourth one, are just top tier in comparison to a lot of the Christian films that are out there. And I think number one, because they have a very clear objective and a very clear target audience. These movies are for the congregation, especially for Christians who seem to think that their faith is only relevant in spaces where people are not offended. The message of Jesus is offensive. There's nothing you can do about that other than to keep walking in the light no matter what. What is this movie about? Did I even say that? So David, Pastor Dave, has been commissioned or, selected or, recruited to run for Congress after the previous candidate suddenly passed away. And they're replaying, a speech he gave before Congress from that fourth movie and think, what, this is our dude, this is our guy. And so it's all about the struggle between him being authentic as a Christian and also wanting to win an election, and how sometimes you have to take a big risk in order to get that objective. But at the end of the day, you have to trust that God knows what he's doing. At the very least, you need to watch the first film just so you're familiar with who Pastor Dave is and who Martin is. I feel like that relationship is essential. If you want, watch the second film, because his opponent, Senator Kaine, was a central figure in the second film. You don't need to watch the second film in order to get an idea as to who that man is. I think Ray Wise, who plays Senator Kaine, gives you everything you need right here. But he's ruthless. The man's sadistic. Now, in terms of what's realistic, I think you have Dave representing, conservative side, and then Kaine representing the liberal side, both very exaggerated. But I think the Kaine's liberal side obviously is very exaggerated. Nobody who's liberal talks like that. They don't talk like that out loud. Senator Kaine is definitely a representation of that liberal side. He's the quiet part out loud, if that makes sense. It's getting real dark. If you watch the debate on Tuesday, there is a debate scene in this movie, and it's eerie how similar the two are, given that this movie was filmed a while ago. But I really enjoyed that, I'm not gonna lie. Now, if you are going to see this movie in theaters, make sure you do show up on time. This is a Fathom Events film. Fathom Events being like a distribution company, and a lot of Christian films distribute through them. With Fathom Events, the trailers, sometimes it's up to the theater's discretion. The theater, if they just do what comes with the movie, it's only 8 minutes. You have 8 minutes to get in your seat before the movie starts. You might get that 20 minutes of trailers, but show up on time. Another issue I had is, I don't know if this was just the theater that I was in. Now, I know that side, I'm here all the time. I know that side of the theater, the screen is just not my favorite. The movies tend to be a little bit darker, so I don't know if there's an issue with the way the movie was lit, or if it was just the theater itself, but the movie was a little dark and it just bothered me. But truthfully, I think it was an issue with the theater. But yeah, I liked it. It was good. I'd watch that again, definitely.